Welcome back to WorkBuzz's summer series. We're doing quick deep dives into subjects around employee listening that are really important. So we've been talking about areas that move the needle in employee listening, such as managers, employees, the progression of employee listening programs, and today's topic, leadership. Leadership is obviously a critical part of any employee listening journey. And today I'm going to be exploring the good, the bad, and ugly around leadership with Ryan. Ryan is our VP of People Science and is an expert on all things engagement and employee experience. With Ryan, his team of people scientists, we have the pleasure of being able to sit with hundreds of leadership teams across the course of a year, where we talk to them about their employee listening programs, their survey findings, and what they've got ahead of them. So I'm really delighted to be sat here with Ryan, who has so much exposure to leadership teams and can bring to life a little bit of his insight from those many hours in the boardroom. So let's get into it. So Ryan, I think we've talked about this quite often, about when it comes to leadership in this day and age, what we've seen is a bit of a shift more recently back towards top-down, autocratic leadership styles. And that's kind of global across lots of different organisations. Do you think that from your experience, this is a cyclical pattern, or is there something else that we're missing and we need to actively disrupt at this point in time?
Well, it's great to be back for another series, starting off with a big question. I think my view with the leadership is what we're seeing with the move back towards top-down, more kind of command and control style of leading is it stems from uncertainty. So there's no real blueprint for us to just follow around how to lead our businesses at this particular moment in time. We know that colleagues, particularly younger generations coming into the workplace, are looking to leaders more than ever for that kind of inspiration. Data tells us that confidence in leadership is declining. So with all of that uncertainty that creates for leaders as to how do we navigate this, natural psychological responses to try and take control of it. And that's resulting in kind of less listening, giving less kind of time or almost patience to understanding how colleagues are feeling, getting kind of colleague suggestions and ideas. But the challenge is that we know how important that listening is to creating proper connection between colleagues and leaders. And that connection is what builds confidence and trust in leadership teams. So again, it's about how we tell the story, how we show leaders just how their style and the way in which they're building connections or not building connections with their colleagues is having a fundamental impact on not just the engagement of their people, but the performance of their people and the performance of the business as well. So I think a lot of it stems from uncertainty, as well as kind of shifts in the labour market. So it was a candidates market a few years ago. People talked about that and the great resignation, whether that was a myth or there was the data there. There was a real sense of confidence among candidates around looking for other opportunities. That led to more organisations prioritising talking more about their value proposition and listening more and wanting to make a really great colleague experience. And it feels like we're having that ongoing battle now to try and kind of keep that as high on the agenda for senior leaders. Yeah.
You talked there a lot about, having the right narrative, the right storytelling, the right investment, ROI story brought to life for leaders to be brought in. Based on the many hours you spend with people teams as well, how would you coach them or encourage them to make that case for themselves internally with leaders? I know it's often a problem for them that their leaders have gone back to this kind of command and control style and they need the proof before they necessarily buy in. How would you encourage the people team to kind of navigate this current situation they find themselves in?
I think the starting point is to look at and think about where they've had challenges with leaders before. Flip side of that, which leaders have they found to naturally be more interested or inclined to take an interest and support them and champion this stuff? Know your audience, know who is on side, know who you need to try and get on side. Really think about what it's going to take to get certain leaders on side. So I think a big starting point is to think about, and reflect on what is the biggest challenge to us getting leaders to prioritize listening, and what would help us create a stronger level of engagement from leaders to listening, and use that to really think about how you're going to approach it. I think there's still a big gap in terms of the amount of organizations that have a really strong connection between listening and what they learn from their colleagues to what they change and how that impacts something that leaders care about. If you can create that story and make it or almost irrefutable evidence of why listening matters inside your organization, you'll get leaders to kind of flip, and it'll all of a sudden be something that they want to prioritize. And the behavioral change that you'll notice will be leaders asking, when are we doing this again? Or what else could we go out and ask colleagues around? And that, as soon as you start to notice that change in them, you've got them really truly behind listening.
Yeah. You're mentioning the changes there, and sometimes leaders say culture is a priority, but then they don't actually change what they're rewarding or tolerating in terms of those bad behaviours as well. When that happens in an organisation, what happens on the ground? What's the effect of that?
Well, I think psychological safety is a word that many of our listeners will have heard. I don't want to say it's a buzzword, but it's certainly something lots of organizations are talking about. I think really understanding what it means and what it looks like is really important for leaders and managers, because they will often say, we have psychological safety here. People can be themselves and say what they want. They can share their thoughts. But really, can they? Because little behaviors, right through to some of those bigger cultural cues, like what you've mentioned, rewarding bad behavior or listening but then ignoring the feedback, they are examples of behaviors which harm psychological safety and make people think, well, actually, I can't share my honest thought and feedback, or it's not okay for me to behave in a certain way because actually what I'm seeing is these other behaviors are what gets rewarded here. So I think the challenge for organizations is that as soon as leaders or any individual in an organization is allowed to behave a certain way that isn't in line with the values and the behaviors that the organization talks about, the credibility and authenticity around the values frameworks and behavioral frameworks is gone. And there's no way around it. And what you'll often hear with organizations is, oh, yes, but he or she is. As soon as the role modeling is gone in terms of the wrong behaviors are being role modeled and being accepted, all of those statements around values and behaviors lose their credibility.
Yeah, they become the words just on the wall
again. They become the words on the wall.
Yeah.
Become the words on the wall, absolutely.
Okay. That's really interesting. And I think, we can talk a lot about, what bad looks like at the moment, and we've seen some horror stories in the past. But I think one thing that we've seen as well that's a really good thing is sometimes we're going to get engagement results or survey feedback that we just don't like. They are bad engagement results. There's been a low response rate. And one thing that probably separates really excellent leadership is how we respond to that. What does handling really bad results or a tough set of results actually look like in practice from a leadership perspective?
Accepting that that's how people feel.
Yes.
So straight away, if what you're seeing as a response to survey feedback is trying to qualify it or dismiss it, but that'll just be a number of individuals who think this, or but those individuals are always saying something like that. And as soon as you start trying to excuse data away and insight away and feedback away, that is another example of kind of harming psychological safety within your organization because you're being dismissive of the feedback. I think also there's a bit there in the language you use around bad survey results is actually defining what that really means.
Yeah.
Because actually a set of survey results that have really honest, open feedback where people have expressed the vulnerability to give their honest feeling of how they work is actually a pretty good data set.
Yeah.
It's got the richness, it's got the genuine feedback, it's got the vulnerability throughout it. I think organizations often get too focused on participation and response rate and benchmarking against competitor, whereas actually what I like to see as a leader or manager really wanting to understand what the data is telling them and why people might be feeling the way that they're feeling. So it's getting past that immediate and initial almost defensive dismissiveness that might come if you see some low scores or a score that's declined compared to previous years. You need to maintain that curiosity to want to understand it. That is critical for actually wanting to act on it.
Yeah. You mentioned benchmarking there. Can you talk to me about your thoughts around benchmarking and what does good benchmarking look like in terms of those practices?
Yeah, benchmarking is a really interesting one. It's one of those that it's almost put at the very top of the list by leaders for what they need from any kind of employee surveying. Mm-hmm. The challenge with it is that it often then gets in the way of asking really genuine, targeted questions that give you the richness that you need as an organization. So you're almost asking questions that can be quite vanilla and generic just so that you unlock that benchmarking capability. The reality of it as well is the other downside to it is sometimes it then becomes the reason to not do anything. Yeah. So if you're on or above the benchmark, it's, oh, we're good. If you're just below it, it's, oh, but we're going through change at the moment, or, you know, we launched the survey within a couple of months after X or Y event, and that's the reason why engagement. So it becomes the anchor for you to kind of find a reason not to do anything with the results. And that's another challenge with benchmarking. The irony of benchmarking is that I've had so many conversations with organizations, with their leadership teams around composition of benchmarking, depth of benchmarking, that'll often even get lost in comments like, oh, yes, but, you know, what about if we class the neutral as being a non-negative response? How would we then benchmark? All of that stuff happens. But the irony is that after a few minutes of having that conversation, the majority of the time, leaders completely forget about benchmarking and they start to really get into the survey insights if they're challenged to get past the benchmarking and do that. And then all of a sudden you think, well, you spent so much time planning this survey, focusing on wanting to have this benchmarking, but actually once you're in the room really exploring it, you're wishing that we'd asked some other questions about this, or we'd asked some questions around that. So my guidance or advice to listeners out there is really lean into the benchmarking conversations early on and challenge it.
Yeah.
Challenge why it's really needed, to what level it's needed. Really help leaders understand what they're sacrificing by prioritizing it too much.
Yeah. No, really helpful feedback. And I think something that we see a lot of people fall into the kind of pitfall of benchmarking must be there, but it doesn't necessarily give you the same insight that other questions would.
Yeah.
You did mention there about going through change. And in this day and age, going through change as a business or an organization is inevitable. And when it comes to change, it can be really uncomfortable as a human to go through that. So when you see organizations going through a change curve, what can they do in terms of employee listening to keep focus and make sure that they're doing the right thing as they progress through that change curve?
Remember that communication's two-way. So you have to over-communicate as much as you can about the things that you can share, but make sure that those messages actually get out to all colleagues, and we can build on that a little bit, but also listen, understand how colleagues are feeling, give them the opportunities to ask questions, give them the opportunities to put forward suggestions, but make sure they feel heard during times of change. Yes, change can have a negative impact on some individuals. Everyone can respond to change in different ways, but it's possible to have a real positive impact and manage change more effectively. When we did our future of work research last year with HR practitioners specifically, the number one thing that they identified leaders needing to do more effectively was communicating and managing change better. When you then look at other research around leadership confidence in managing change, leaders have an overinflated kind of level of confidence in how well they believe they communicate the why behind strategy, behind change. We know that it's not landing and it's not connecting. So again, it's just making sure that leaders really understand the need to properly connect. And connecting is not sending out a briefing. It's not doing a town hall and giving a 5-minute update. It's more than that. It's really listening and properly understanding how people are feeling about the change, empathizing with them, show them that you really understand any uncertainty or anxiety that they might even be feeling, and lean into it and give them the opportunity to ask questions and hear and show that you hear it and that you really do understand it. I think more of that authentic listening needs to happen more than ever during times of change. But sometimes because leaders worry about not having all the answers, they maybe shy away from having those types of conversations. I think one of the best things leaders can do sometimes is actually say, I don't know the answers. We can ask, and I can, managers as well. I don't know, but we can explore this. We can find out, we can ask, we can try and get the information, but it's about embracing that uncertainty at times.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important point around change. And as you communicate, understanding that people might not even be in a space to hear it all. So therefore, the repetition of the same message, the repetition of the why that you brought up is critical again and again and again in many different ways, in so many different forums. And that's part of the leadership role. And it to the point where you're so sick of the message, that's the only way that you can get it through.
And be human in it. Again, make sure that the communication during the change is authentic. And also don't almost write people off just if they don't understand the change or feel positive about it or feel how you want them to feel from the first time they hear about it, because that's okay. You might have two individuals who are polar opposites in terms of how positive they are about the change, but actually 1 year down the line, the person who was initially more negative about it could be more of a positive advocate and a higher performer for your organization than the other individual. So you have to make sure you understand where that hesitance or uncertainty comes from. Do they just need a bit more of an opportunity to process it and reflect on it? Do they need more information around it? Do they just need an opportunity to ask questions? You really think about the individual.
We've been speaking a lot about leadership, and leadership visibility is definitely a challenge. I think it's even more challenging when you talk about frontline employees and those organisations that have a more deskless experience. How do the best leaders stay genuinely connected in a frontline organisation in terms of what's happening on the ground?
Again, it's about really designing for the audience, right? So I hear a lot of leaders talking about, we're seeing an increase in the amount of town halls that organizations are using, right? And I'm not here to say town halls aren't impactful, but town halls aren't truly inclusive. And what I mean by that is there will be some demographics and populations inside your organization there where it's more accessible for them from a time and from a tech perspective to be able to dedicate half an hour to join in a town hall. And what often happens is after town halls are ran, they get recorded and the recording gets shared. But again, we need to think about who it is we're communicating with. Some of those frontline workers, whether we're looking at people who work in manufacturing on the front line or retail hospitality, we know, again, if we use the research, that the majority of them are spending 10 minutes a day, if that, actually processing, digesting all of the communication that an organization sends to them. So as soon as you send them a link to a half an hour, 1 hour recording for communication briefing that's happened through something like a town hall, the uptake is going to be pretty much zero. So really thinking about, well, how do we get key messages out to those populations? How do they engage with communications currently? What channels would they engage with more? What's the amount of time that we have to be able to land these messages with them? the organizations that are rated the highest from a communication perspective are doing all of this thinking and factoring it in to how they're communicating. Of course, other things that leaders can do is think about their opportunity to walk the floor and do visits out to some of those areas. I mean, I had an organization I was working with this year where we talked about even those town halls, actually running them from their distribution center rather than always doing it from head office.
Yeah.
Because while you're there and you've got your entire executive leadership team there, through natural just osmosis, they're going to end up just having these conversations and talking about things that will be understood by someone who'll then pass it on to other colleagues. But while they're there, they'll naturally be spending that time with individuals who won't see them as often. So I think it's just being planful.
Yeah. Back to the floor days.
Back to the
There's
floor.
Nothing like them. Yeah, absolutely.
But just put yourself in the shoes of the individuals that you
Yeah.
want to reach and think about how do they need you to connect with them.
Yeah.
Biggest challenge for leaders will always be how do I make time for this?
Yeah. And having the right tooling sometimes.
Having the right
as well
tooling to
can-
do it as well. Absolutely. And that's a big thing for us here at WorkBuzz. You know, we're talking about how do we go beyond just the surveys and getting voice at scale to how do we actually give leaders the opportunity to connect with large groups of colleagues, maybe specific colleague populations, and get their feedback and their ideas and suggestions on something that really matters from an operational perspective. And what we're seeing where we're using that tool with organizations is just that kind of sense of connection increasing and that sense of engagement improving, but then having senior leaders as well who are saying, wow, this has given me such valuable feedback in such a short space of time. So
especially on the operational loops.
Exactly.
And
Absolutely.
pulling them back in. I think it's, especially when we're making changes, sometimes as leaders, we might assume that they've gone down really well or things have worked. But if you can find out, I guess, earlier and sooner in the process, then
Yeah, absolutely.
it helps.
Definitely.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. So thinking about leadership and our discussion today, if you could share just 2 key takeaways for our audience to take from our discussion, what would they be?
That listening and creating connections between leaders, so shop floor, top floor connection is absolutely critically important. The biggest thing that will build confidence and trust in leaders is better quality listening. So that would be takeaway number 1. Takeaway number 2, I think would be almost again an empathy with leaders that this is really difficult in today's world, particularly if you're a leader in an organization that has thousands of colleagues and a really dispersed workforce. So that piece around really exploring how they can better create those connections with colleagues to get the insight that they need is really important.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for your insights today. That's been really helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast series. This was the 3rd of 4 different topics that we're talking about. You can watch the other 3 topics on progression through your leadership journeys and talking about management, progression through your listening maturity model, and employees on our website or on our WorkBuzz YouTube channel. As always, if you want to talk to WorkBuzz at any point, please just visit www.workbuzz.com and get in contact with us. We'd love to talk to you more about leadership or any of the topics that we've explored during this series. Thanks for listening.